The last stagecoach of the season rolled into Harlan Creek, Wyoming on the 4th day of November, 1883, with its wheels already caked in the first pale frost of winter, and aboard it sat a woman who had nothing but a carpet bag, a spine made of iron, and a heart full of wounds she had not yet learned to name. Catherine Shelton pressed her face close to the small, frost-edged window of the coach and watched the town materialize out of the gray afternoon like something half-remembered from a dream. She had been traveling for 11 days, from St. Louis through Kansas City, and then further west by rail and finally by coach across the sage-covered flats of Wyoming territory. Her back ached. Her fingers were stiff inside her thin gloves. The wool of her traveling dress, once the color of deep burgundy, had faded at the cuffs and collar from too many dusty miles, and she wore it like a second skin she could not quite shed. She was 26 years old, and she had left everything she had ever known behind her in a city that no longer felt like home, if it ever had. The coach lurched to a stop in front of the Harlan Creek Stage Depot, a low building of unpainted pine that shuddered in the wind. The driver, a weathered man named Otis who had barely spoken 2 sentences to her during the entire journey, called down from his box in a voice rough as gravel. "End of the line, miss. Last run before winter. We won't be coming through again until March, Lord willing." Catherine absorbed that information as she gathered her carpet bag and descended the 2 iron steps to the frozen ground. March. That was 4 months away. She stood in the street and looked down the length of Harlan Creek, taking stock of what she had arrived in. There was a general store, a blacksmith's shop, a building with a hand-painted sign reading Doc Hayward, a saloon called the Copper Nail, a small church with a weather vane bent sideways in the wind, and perhaps a dozen other structures in various states of permanence. A few horses stood tied at hitching posts, their breath rising in small clouds. 2 men in heavy coats crossed the street without looking at her. A dog lay in the doorway of the general store as if it had been there since the beginning of time. Catherine had been told, by a woman she had met on the train in Kansas City, that there was a boarding house in Harlan Creek run by a Mrs. Aldrich. The woman on the train had been emphatic about it. "Clean sheets," she had said. "Good biscuits in the morning." The woman had been wrong about the railroad depot having an afternoon train, and Catherine was beginning to suspect she had been wrong about the boarding house as well. She went to the general store first, because the dog in the doorway seemed like a good omen, and because she needed someone to point her in the right direction before the temperature dropped any further. The inside of the store smelled of tobacco, sawdust, and pickled brine. A man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose looked up from behind the counter. "Afternoon," he said, studying her with the frank curiosity that people in small places reserve for strangers. "Just come off the stage." "I did," Catherine said. "I'm looking for a boarding house, a Mrs. Aldrich." The man's expression did something complicated and then settled into sympathy. "Martha Aldrich passed on in September," he said. "Fever. Her daughter took the house back to Cheyenne. There's no boarding house in Harlan Creek now." Catherine held very still. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls of the store and the building groaned quietly. She had $22 in her bag, a change of clothes, a small Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a letter of reference from a school superintendent in St. Louis that she had been hoping to use to find work as a schoolteacher. She had no reservation anywhere, no arrangement waiting for her, no person in this town who knew her name. "Is there a hotel?" she asked. "No, ma'am, never had the need for one. People here mostly know where they're sleeping." She thanked him and stood for a moment in the warmth of the store, thinking. The man behind the counter, whose name she later learned was Percy Grubb, was watching her with genuine concern overlaying his natural nosiness. "You could try Hugh Bristol," he said finally, as though arriving at the thought reluctantly. "He's got a proper house out on the north edge of town, has a room he doesn't use. He's a decent man." He paused. "Strange sometimes, but decent." "Is he expecting anyone?" "Hugh Bristol is never expecting anyone," Percy said. "That's sort of the point of him." Catherine thanked him again and asked for directions. Percy drew them with his finger on the wooden countertop, as though the grain of the wood were a map, and she memorized the turns before pushing back out into the cold. The north edge of Harlan Creek was not far, but the wind had picked up and it cut through her dress with a meanness that felt personal. She walked with her carpet bag in her right hand and her head down, counting the structures Percy had described. The smithy on her left, then the water pump, then the narrow lane that went between two houses and opened onto a wider track that ran due north. At the end of that track, set back from the road behind a fence of lodgepole pine rails, was a house. It was not a grand house, but it was a real one, built of squared timber with a proper roof and two windows facing south and a porch that ran the full width of the front. Smoke came from the chimney in a thick, reassuring column. There was a barn behind it, and beyond the barn the land opened up into what might, in summer, be a pasture. Everything about it was solid and carefully made, the kind of building that a person had put real thought into. Catherine opened the gate in the pine rail fence and walked up the path to the porch. She knocked. The man who opened the door was not at all what she had been picturing. Percy Grubb had said strange, and she had imagined something hunched and squinting. Hugh Bristol was neither. He was tall, with the kind of lean, functional build that came from years of physical work, and he stood in the doorway filling it in a way that was not quite blocking it, his dark hair slightly too long at the collar, his jaw carrying the shadow of several days without a razor. He was 31 years old, though she would not learn that until later. His eyes were the color of weathered cedar, brown with flecks of amber, and they were watching her with an expression that was not unfriendly but was distinctly careful, as though he had learned to take the full measure of a thing before committing to it. He was wearing a flannel shirt tucked into heavy canvas trousers, and his boots had been resoled at some point recently, which she noticed because she noticed things. He had been working on something before she knocked. There was a smear of pine sap on his right forearm. "Mr. Bristol," she said. "Yes," he said. He waited. He was a man, she would learn, who did not fill silence with unnecessary sound. "My name is Catherine Shelton. I came in on the stage this afternoon. I was told there was a boarding house here in town, but I've been told the woman who ran it passed away in the fall. Percy Grubb suggested you might have a room available." She held herself very straight because her mother had told her that posture was dignity made visible, and dignity was the one thing that could not be taken from you unless you surrendered it yourself. "I can pay. I have a letter of reference. I'm looking for work as a schoolteacher. I intend to establish myself here, and I don't expect charity, only a reasonable arrangement." Hugh Bristol looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the carpet bag in her hand, and the frost on the brim of her hat, and the way her breath came out white and thin in the cold. He stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. The inside of the house was warm. That was the first thing she registered, a deep and settling warmth from a stone fireplace that took up most of the south wall of the main room. The room itself was spare but not neglected. There was a table of solid pine with two chairs, a tall bookcase crowded with volumes whose spines were cracked from real reading, a kerosene lamp on the table throwing good amber light, and on the floor a woven rug the color of autumn grass. There was a door to the right leading to what she assumed was a bedroom, and a door to the left leading to a kitchen from which came the smell of something slow-cooked and savory. "Sit down," Hugh said, moving to the kitchen. "I'll get some coffee." Catherine sat at the table and took off her gloves and held her hands close to the warmth radiating from the fireplace. She could feel her fingers again within a minute, and that felt like a mercy. She looked at the bookshelf. She saw a worn copy of a Dickens novel, a survey of Wyoming territory geology, two almanacs, a book of poetry by Longfellow, and what appeared to be a cattle ranching manual. Hugh Bristol came back with 2 tin mugs of coffee and set one in front of her and sat down across the table. He wrapped both hands around his own mug and looked at her with that same unhurried assessment. "You came on the last stage," he said. "Yes." "Did you know it was the last one?" She hesitated for just a moment. I did not know until the driver told me just now. I was told there was service through November. There was until last year. Rourke's Pass ices over early. They moved the cutoff to the 1st of November 2 seasons ago. He said it matter-of-factly, not with any cruelty in it, just the plain acknowledgement of a fact. So you're here until March. So it seems, Catherine said. She lifted the coffee and drank. It was strong and slightly bitter and exactly what she needed. I was serious about what I said on the porch. I can pay. I have references. I intend to find work. Is there a school here? I don't know yet. I've only seen the town from the street. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile but approaching one. There's a building they use as a school Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Martin Farley teaches it when he's not needed on his brother's ranch. He's not a real teacher. He paused. The children deserve better. That small pronouncement lodged itself in her mind like a seed finding soil. Then there's work to be done, she said. Hugh Bristol drank his coffee and looked at the fire. Then he looked at her again. The room, he said. I only have the one, my bedroom. That's your room. I couldn't take your bedroom, Mr. Bristol. Surely there's somewhere else. I sleep in the barn half the winter anyway, he said. I have a calving heifer that needs checking through the night. It's warmer than you'd think with the animals. He said it simply, as though this were the most natural arrangement in the world. The house would be yours, you'd have privacy. There's a lock on the bedroom door. The kitchen is stocked. Catherine stared at him. You would give me your whole house. I'd give you the use of it, he said carefully. I take my meals here morning and evening if that's acceptable to you. The kitchen is not something I'm willing to negotiate on. She almost smiled at that, almost. I think that's entirely reasonable, she said. And the payment? $2 a week, he said, against what I put away for the room. She knew it was less than market value for a room anywhere in the territory, but she also knew that she was not in a position to negotiate upward. Agreed, she said. Thank you, Mr. Bristol. Hugh, he said, standing up and picking up his mug. People in this territory don't have the patience for formality. Catherine, she replied. He nodded once as though they had concluded a contract. In a way she supposed they had. That first night, Catherine unpacked her carpet bag in Hugh Bristol's bedroom and looked at the space that was now temporarily hers. The bed was solid and functional, made up with a heavy quilt in a log cabin pattern, the kind of piecing that took patience. There was a washstand with a porcelain basin and pitcher, a small mirror on the wall, tilted slightly to the left, a wooden chair with a coat hook behind the door. 2 more books on the windowsill, a farmer's almanac for 1882 and a slender volume of Scottish ballads. She picked up the ballads and turned it over in her hands. Inside the front cover, in handwriting that was careful and slightly too formal, someone had written, H.B., September 1875. 8 years he had owned this book. She set it back down and went to the window and looked out at the dark. The barn was a black shape against the blacker field. A light moved in there, a lantern, back and forth like a slow pendulum. Hugh Bristol was checking on his heifer. He had given her the whole house and gone to sleep with his animals in the cold. She stood at the window for a long time watching that light move. The next morning she woke to the smell of frying pork and the sound of someone working quietly in a kitchen. She dressed quickly, appreciating the cold water in the washstand pitcher for exactly 1 second before pressing her face into a towel, and then pinning her hair as neatly as she could manage without the benefit of the elaborate arrangements she had kept in St. Louis. She came out of the bedroom to find Hugh standing at the cast-iron stove, turning slices of salt pork in a heavy pan with a long-handled fork. There was cornbread on the table, already cut, and a jar of preserves that looked homemade. "Good morning," she said. "Morning." He glanced at her briefly. Coffee's on the windowsill, cups on the shelf above the stove. She poured her coffee and sat at the table and watched him work. He moved around the small kitchen with the efficiency of someone who has performed the same tasks so many times they have become a kind of language, the reach for the plate without looking, the shift of the pan handle at exactly the right angle. He brought the pork to the table and sat down across from her, and they ate together in a quiet that was not uncomfortable. "How long have you been in Harlan Creek?" she asked. 7 years, he said. Came from Colorado originally. Followed the cattle trade up here in '76 and stayed. What made you stay? He considered this as he ate. The land is serious here, he said. It doesn't pretend to be easy. I respect that in a thing. She thought that was one of the more interesting reasons she had ever heard a person give for choosing a place to live. She said so, and he looked at her with that careful expression again as though recalibrating something. What brought you out here? He asked. From wherever you started. St. Louis, she said. I was teaching at a private school there, for girls. The family that ran it decided girls only needed 2 years of formal education, and I told them I disagreed, and they told me my disagreement was noted, and my services were no longer required. She said it evenly, but the edges of it were still sharp inside her. I had a cousin in Cheyenne who wrote me that the territories were desperate for teachers, that the schools out here needed people with real credentials, so I wrote to several towns. Harlan Creek was one of them. I received a letter from the town council saying they would welcome a teacher. Hugh set down his fork. From the town council? Yes, 3 months ago. Our town council is Eli Carpenter, Percy Grubb, and Walt Fentress, Hugh said slowly. They have a meeting every other Tuesday at the Copper Nail. Then I suppose I'll be speaking to them. Eli Carpenter is the one you want, Hugh said. Percy talks too much and Walt Fentress is mostly interested in whether your presence will bring trouble. Neither of those things is personal. That's just how they are. She appreciated the briefing. It was practical and precise, and she filed it carefully. After breakfast, Hugh went back to the barn and Catherine walked into town to see about her future. She found Eli Carpenter at the hardware store he owned on the main street, a compact, brisk man with a gray beard trimmed close and the handshake of someone who had been shaking hands in business contexts for 30 years. He remembered the letter they had sent. He was pleased she had arrived, though somewhat alarmed by her traveling alone. We have 22 children in this town of school age, he said, from 6 to 14. Right now they're getting Martin Farley twice a week, and that's not going to take them far. We can offer you the schoolroom, which is the old claims office at the end of Sycamore Street, and $15 a month from the town fund. It was less than what she had made in St. Louis, but cost of living was different here, and she had a room. I'll take it, she said. I'd like to start Monday. Eli Carpenter looked at her with the kind of approval that was also slightly surprised, as if he had expected negotiations. Monday it is, he said. Walking back through Harlan Creek in the thin November sunshine, Catherine felt something unclench in her chest. She was not saved exactly, she was not comfortable, and she was not home. But she had a direction. She had a room. She had a fire someone else had laid and a man who had given her his house without asking anything of her except that she let him eat breakfast at his own table. She bought a small notebook from Percy Grubb's store and a pencil, nodded at Percy, who was transparently dying to ask questions, and went back to the house on the north edge of town. She spent the afternoon reading through everything she had brought with her, her curriculum materials from St. Louis, her mathematics primers, her readers, and making notes about what she would need. The school building, she had seen from the outside, would need preparation. She wrote a list. The fire in the main room kept her warm, and she sat at the table with her papers spread around her and lost herself in the planning, which was the one thing she had always been able to do well. Look at a problem's shape and begin making it smaller. Hugh came back inside at mid-afternoon to get something from the kitchen and paused when he saw the table covered in her papers. Found work already? He asked. I start Monday, she said. I'm planning my first week. He stood there for a moment, looking at the papers and then at her, and something moved through his face that was not quite surprise and not quite admiration, but was somewhere between the two. Then he went to the kitchen for what he had come for, a piece of tallow that he apparently needed for something in the barn, and went back out. Catherine watched the door close and then went back to her papers. That evening, Hugh cooked again. He did not ask whether she wanted to help, and he did not perform any ceremony about it. He simply cooked, and when it was ready, he put it on the table and they ate together. This time it was venison stew, rich and dark with root vegetables and cornbread again, and she ate 2 portions and felt the warmth of the food settle through her in a way that was almost physical comfort. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" she asked. "My mother," he said. "She believed a man who couldn't feed himself was a half-finished thing." "She sounds formidable." She was. He said it without heaviness, but there was something underneath it. She died in 79. Winter fever, same as a lot of people. "I'm sorry," Catherine said, and meant it. He nodded once. They ate for a moment in silence. "My mother died when I was 15, Catherine offered. She did not usually offer this. It was the kind of information she kept banked against use as currency, but it seemed right to say it here, in this particular kitchen, in this particular conversation. My father remarried quickly. A woman who was not unkind but who had no particular use for a stepdaughter who read too much and asked too many questions. I was sent to my aunt in St. Louis when I was 17. The aunt was a teacher. That's how I became one." Hugh looked at her across the table. "And is there anyone in St. Louis waiting for you to come back?" It was a direct question. She appreciated it more than she would have expected to. "No," she said, "not anymore." He did not press for more, which she also appreciated. He simply nodded and reached for the cornbread. The days that followed were a kind of building. Catherine opened the school on Monday morning to find 14 children of varying ages and temperaments seated on 3 long benches in a room that smelled of old paper and was very cold. She got the iron stove going first, because education cannot happen when fingers are too numb to hold a slate pencil, and then she looked at the children and they looked back at her, and she began. The children of Harlan Creek were not delicate. They were the children of ranchers and shopkeepers and a blacksmith and a woman who ran the laundry service. They had various amounts of previous schooling ranging from substantial, in the case of a 12-year-old girl named Anna Carpenter, Eli's daughter, to essentially none, in the case of 2 brothers named Dex and Ruddy Moss who had grown up on a ranch, so remote that the idea of sitting still for multiple hours was visibly foreign to them. Catherine took stock of all of it and divided them into 3 rough groups and began where they were, which was the only sensible place to begin. By Wednesday she had all 14 showing up, plus 2 more who had apparently heard about it from the others and simply appeared at the door. She let them in. By Friday the stove in the claims office had become unreliable, and the room grew cold in the afternoons, and she wrote a note to Eli Carpenter about it. That Friday evening, she came back to Hugh's house with cold hands and tired eyes, and the particular exhaustion of having been fully present for human beings for 6 hours, and Hugh was already in the kitchen. He had made coffee, and there was a plate of something on the table covered with a cloth, because he had learned by then that she arrived home cold and hungry, and that it was faster and more efficient to have food ready than to start from scratch. She sat down and pulled off her gloves and wrapped her hands around the coffee mug and said, "The stove in the schoolroom is failing." "I know," Hugh said from the kitchen. "I heard Eli talking about it at the store. Flue's corroded. He needs to replace it. He needs to spend money he's decided he doesn't have on something he's decided is not urgent," Hugh said. There was a dry precision to how he said it. "Children cannot learn in a room that's below freezing." He came to the doorway of the kitchen. "No," he said, "they can't." He looked at her for a moment. "There's a good stove in my barn that I replaced last year with a larger one. I kept the old one because it's still functional. I could move it to the school building." She looked up at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because the children deserve better," he said, which was exactly what he had said the first night she arrived. It was clearly a principle of his rather than a statement of specific intent. "That's very generous," she said. He shrugged in a way that suggested generosity was not how he was thinking about it. "It's practical," he said. "The stove's not doing anything useful sitting in my barn." He moved the stove the following Saturday with the help of 2 men from town, a quiet act of labor that solved the problem completely. The schoolroom was warm by Monday. Catherine noticed that he accepted no thanks for it beyond a single nod when she acknowledged it, as though drawing attention to the thing would somehow diminish it. She was beginning to understand him in pieces. Hugh Bristol was a man who had built his life with the same care he had built his house, each element chosen for function and durability rather than appearance. He was not a man of many words, but the words he did use were precise and thoughtful. He read extensively. She had discovered mostly history and science, but also poetry, which surprised her. He had an opinion about almost everything and expressed it plainly when asked and not at all when not asked, which was a restraint she found remarkable in comparison to most people she had met. He rose before dawn and worked until dark, and he cooked every meal they ate together without complaint and without ceremony. He was also lonely. She could see it in the way he sometimes stopped at the edge of conversation, as though surprised to find himself there, as though he had forgotten what it felt like to talk to someone who would actually respond. He had friends in town, she came to understand, Percy Grubb and Eli Carpenter, and a rancher named Tom Lyle whose property abutted his to the west, but friends of the kind that talk about cattle and weather and local politics. Not friends of the kind that talk about books or ideas or the specific weight of a feeling. November deepened. The temperature dropped steadily, and the first real snow came on the 20th, a heavy, deliberate snowfall that covered everything by morning. Catherine stood at the window in the early gray light and watched it and felt something she had not expected to feel: peace. Not the peace of safety exactly, because her situation was still uncertain in several important ways, but the peace of presence. She was here. She was warm. She had something to do each day. She turned from the window to find Hugh already at the stove in the kitchen, starting the morning fire, and the sight of him doing that ordinary thing in the lamplight hit her somewhere beneath the sternum in a way she was not prepared for. She pressed her hand flat against the door frame for a moment and told herself it was nothing, just gratitude, just the particular tenderness of having been unexpectedly rescued from a cold street. She made herself believe that for approximately another 2 weeks. It was a Thursday evening when things shifted. She had been reading at the table after supper, working through the Longfellow she had borrowed from Hugh's shelf with his absent permission, which she had assumed was the same as actual permission. Hugh was sitting in the chair by the fire cleaning his rifle, a Winchester 1873 that he used for hunting, and the room was full of the comfortable sounds of domesticity, the crackle of the fire, the faint wind outside, the whisper of her turning pages. Then she read something aloud, without quite meaning to. Just a few lines from the Song of Hiawatha, a section about the way the seasons change and the world renews itself, and her voice in the quiet room had a sound to it that made Hugh look up. He said nothing. He just listened while she read 3 more lines, and when she stopped he said, "Keep going." She looked at him over the edge of the book. "I haven't read that in years," he said. "I'd like to hear it." So she read to him. She read for nearly an hour, moving through the poem, and Hugh cleaned his rifle and then set it aside and just sat in the firelight listening. His face in that light was different from how it looked in daylight. The carefulness softened out of it, something beneath the surface visible in the way things become visible only when the overhead light is gone and the light comes from below. When she finally stopped, her throat a little dry, he said, "My mother used to read to us in the evenings." What did she read? Whatever she had. She wasn't a woman who drew strict lines between types of books. She'd read the Bible and then follow it directly with a penny novel and not see any contradiction in that. Catherine smiled. It was a real smile, full and unguarded, and she could feel that it was different from the smiles she put on in town, the professional ones, the polite ones. This one came from somewhere lower down. "I think I would have liked her," she said. He looked at her then with an expression she did not have a name for yet but would later recognize as the moment something changed. "I think she would have liked you," he said, and then he looked back at the fire as if he needed to give his attention somewhere else very quickly. They began reading together in the evenings after that. It was not decided or discussed. It simply became the shape of their evenings, supper, the washing up, and then reading at the table or by the fire, sometimes her reading aloud and sometimes him, and sometimes each of them reading separately but in the same room, which was its own kind of intimacy. She read him Dickens, and he read her passages from his geology survey that were actually more interesting than she expected. And they argued pleasantly about poetry, and agreed completely about the importance of education, and disagreed with heat about a piece in the Cheyenne Leader, about the future of the cattle industry that Eli Carpenter had brought to town, and that Hugh had read and left on the table. "You don't think the beef market will hold," she said. "I think it's overextended. The big outfits have brought in too many cattle for the range to support. There'll be a reckoning." "And what does that mean for you?" He looked at the fire. "It means I keep my herd small and my debts smaller. I run 150 head and I'll never run more. I own this land clear. When the crash comes, and it will come, I'll still be here." She believed him. There was something about Hugh Bristol that made you believe the things he said, not because he said them with force or rhetoric, but because he said them with the quiet certainty of someone who has actually thought them through to their ends. "That's wise," she said. "It's just paying attention," he said. He had a habit of deflecting anything that sounded like praise by turning it into something ordinary. December arrived and brought with it the particular silence of deep winter on the Wyoming plain. The world shrank to the town, the school, the house. Catherine's students were making real progress. Anna Carpenter was working through algebra. The Moss brothers, Dex and Ruddy, had turned out to have a gift for arithmetic and a total resistance to grammar that she was slowly, deliberately addressing. A shy girl named Pearl Whitmore had revealed, 2 weeks in, that she could not see the slate board clearly from the back bench, and Catherine had written to Doc Hayward about it, and he had confirmed nearsightedness and ordered spectacles from Cheyenne that were due in the spring. These children mattered to her. She had not expected to be surprised by that. Teaching had always mattered to her. But these children mattered in a specific and personal way that had to do with who they were. With Ruddy Moss's grin when he solved a problem. With Anna Carpenter's precise and searching questions. With Pearl Whitmore's slow transformation from hidden to present. Harlan Creek had not been her destination in any planned sense. She had aimed in its general direction and arrived here by accident and circumstance. But the school, and the children in it, were beginning to feel like something she had been moving toward without knowing it. One afternoon in the second week of December, she came home to find a man at Hugh's gate. He was broad and dark-coated, and he was talking to Hugh in a low voice that carried the particular register of an unpleasant conversation. Catherine slowed her pace, reading the scene. Hugh's posture had changed. He was still, the careful kind of still that was not relaxation but its opposite. She went in through the gate, and the man glanced at her with the brief evaluation of someone who has been taught to evaluate everything that moves. "Miss," the man said. "Afternoon," she said, and went up to the porch and stopped because she was not going to walk away from something that was happening at Hugh's house. Hugh looked at her and then at the man. "Catherine, this is Wade Cutter. He runs cattle for the Bar S outfit north of town." Wade Cutter had the look of a man who was accustomed to operating in a context where physical size was the primary argument. He was not hostile exactly, but he was applying a kind of pressure that had nothing to do with his words. "Mr. Bristol and I were just discussing some grazing land," Wade said to her, with a polite surface that dismissed her even while addressing her. "Mr. Cutter represents people who would like to expand their range south," Hugh said to Catherine, with a directness she understood was informational and also a small act of refusal toward whatever Cutter was trying to keep private. "I've told him the land isn't for sale or lease." "The Bar S is a considerable operation," Wade said. "They're prepared to be generous." "I don't have a price," Hugh said. He said it the way he said everything, simply and without decoration, and it was somehow more final than shouting would have been. Wade Cutter looked at Catherine once more as though assessing whether she was a variable and apparently concluded she was not one he could use. He nodded at Hugh. "We'll talk again," he said. "I doubt it," Hugh said. Cutter walked back down the track toward town. Catherine watched him go and then looked at Hugh, who was watching the same direction. "Is he going to be trouble?" she asked. "He's already trouble," Hugh said. "The Bar S has been pushing south for 2 years. They got Tom Lyle's east pasture last spring. Tom needed the money and they made an offer he couldn't walk away from. They'd do the same here if they could." He turned to go inside. "They can't. Because you won't sell. Because I own the deed clear and I have neighbors who know it and I'm not a man who can be frightened." He held the door for her and she went inside and the warmth of the house wrapped around her. Later that night after supper, while the fire had burned down to a warm red glow, Catherine said, "Has anyone ever frightened you?" Hugh was quiet for a moment. The question hung in the warm air between them. "Once," he said. "When I first came out here, I was 24. I didn't know the country yet. I got turned around on the ridge in a November storm, the same kind of cold as this, and I spent 2 nights in the open before Tom Lyle found me." He paused. "That frightened me. The feeling of being completely alone in a thing that was larger than anything I had a strategy for." She understood that. She understood it in a way that went past intellectual sympathy. "I know that feeling," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I think you might." The fire crackled. The wind moved against the walls of the house. Neither of them said anything for a while, but the silence had a different quality now. It had weight and warmth and the particular fullness of 2 people who have said something true and recognized its truth in the same moment. Christmas came with snow and the smell of pine. Catherine had organized a small pageant at the school, something she had put together with what she had, which was the children's voices and some paper and paint, and the enthusiasm of people for whom a pageant was the most exciting event in a month. The whole town came to the schoolroom on Christmas Eve and sat on borrowed chairs and watched the children perform, and Ruddy Moss forgot his single line 3 times before delivering it with a triumphant shout that made everyone laugh, and Pearl Whitmore sang a carol in a voice that stopped the room cold for its pure, surprising beauty. Hugh sat in the back row. He was not a man for crowds and she had not expected him to come, but he had put on a clean shirt and come, and he sat through the whole thing with his hands folded on his knees, and when Pearl sang he was as still as the rest of them. Afterward, when Catherine was helping the children collect their things, he came and stood beside her. "You built something here," he said quietly. "The children built it," she said. "I just pointed." "Catherine," he said, and the way he said her name was slightly different from how he had been saying it. There was something in it that had not been there before. She looked up at him. He seemed about to say something more, and then Anna Carpenter's voice cut through the noise of the room, asking Catherine a question about the next week, and the moment folded up and went somewhere else. They walked home through the snow together, because their direction was the same, and the town was quiet around them in the blue-white dark of Christmas Eve in Wyoming, 1883. The snow was fresh, and their footsteps were the first marks in it on the north track, and the sky was very clear and very cold and full of stars in the way a winter sky can be in that country, not just scattered with stars, but so dense with them that the spaces between felt like something added. "I used to think cities were where the real things happened," Catherine said, watching the stars. "The culture, the thought, the importance. And now," she stopped walking and looked up, "and now I think the real things happen wherever people are actually working at them," she said. "I think I was wrong about cities." Hugh stopped beside her. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air, the particular human warmth of someone standing next to you on a cold night. "Where did you think you were going when you got on that stage?" he asked. The real destination, not the practical one. It was a perceptive question. She thought about it honestly. "Away," she said. "I thought I was going away from something, a life that didn't fit." She paused. "I'm not sure I had a clear picture of what I was going toward." Hugh was quiet for a moment, looking at the same sky. "I'm glad the pass iced over early," he said. She looked at him. He was still looking at the stars, his profile clean against the dark sky, and there was something in his face that she had not seen there before, something that was entirely unguarded and entirely clear. He turned to look at her and found her already looking, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement, recognition, the silent admission of a thing that had been building for weeks. He did not kiss her. He was not that kind of man, not a man who moved on impulse, and she was not that kind of woman, and the cold was real and the road was open. But the moment was real. It was as real as the stars. "Merry Christmas, Hugh," she said. "Merry Christmas, Catherine," he said. They walked the rest of the way home in a silence that was the most comfortable thing she had felt in years. January arrived with a cold that was not like any cold Catherine had experienced in St. Louis. It was a cold with intention to it, a cold that pressed against windows and crept under doors and made the water in the washstand pitcher freeze solid before morning. Hugh was up before dawn every day, moving through the dark to the barn, checking the heifer, which had finally calved in mid-December and produced a strong, belligerent calf that Catherine had been introduced to on a clear afternoon when Hugh had led her out to the barn to see it. The calf had looked at her with deep bovine suspicion, and Hugh had looked at the calf with something that was obviously satisfaction even though his face barely moved. "Does she have a name?" Catherine had asked. "She's a calf. Ranchers don't generally name their cattle. That seems like an oversight." He had looked at her then with that almost smile. "What would you name her?" "Clara," Catherine said immediately. "She looks like a Clara." Hugh had looked at the calf for a moment. "I'm not naming a calf Clara." But the following week she had overheard him in the barn saying, in a carefully quiet voice so she would not hear, "All right, Clara, move over." She told no one. She treasured it like a private coin. In January she also began to teach Hugh. Not formally, not with any ceremony about it. She had left some of her arithmetic primers on the table one evening, working through a problem about crop yields and acreage that she was preparing to teach the older students, and Hugh had looked over her shoulder and said something so precise about the calculation that she had turned around. "Where did you learn that?" she asked. "I figured it out," he said. "I've been working land for 7 years. You do the mathematics or you lose money. You figured out differential calculation from land management." "I don't know what you just called it," he said, "but if you mean did I work it out from scratch, yes." She stared at him. Then she got up from the table and went to her bedroom and came back with a different book, one of her teaching manuals from St. Louis, a basic algebra and geometry text, and put it in front of him. "Read through the first 3 chapters," she said, "and tell me what you already know." He looked at the book. Then he looked at her. "Why?" "Because I suspect you've taught yourself most of this without knowing the formal names for any of it," she said, "and giving things their proper names makes them more useful. Also, I think you'd like the formal system. It's elegant." He picked up the book and read through 2 pages while she watched. Then he set it down and said, "This is what I've been doing with the North Pasture yield calculations." "Yes," she said, "and now you have the vocabulary for it." He opened the book again. They spent the next 2 hours working through problems at the kitchen table, and Catherine experienced the very specific pleasure of watching someone encounter something they already know in a form they have never seen before, the recognition and the expansion happening simultaneously. Hugh worked through problems with the focused intensity he brought to everything, and when he got something wrong, he wanted to know exactly why it was wrong, not just the correction but the principle underneath the error. At some point she realized she had moved her chair around to his side of the table so she could see his work more clearly, and at some point after that she realized they were sitting very close together and he was warm and smelled of wood smoke and winter air, and he was bent over a page with that absolute concentration, and she was watching his hands hold the pencil, and she was in very significant trouble. She moved her chair back around to her side of the table and said something about the next problem set and kept her voice entirely level. And Hugh looked up from the page and looked at her and then looked back at the page, and she could not tell whether he had noticed anything or not. In February, the bar's trouble came back. Tom Lyle appeared at Hugh's door on the 2nd morning of February, which was unusual because Tom Lyle was not an indoor visiting kind of man, and his face when Hugh let him in carried the gray of genuine worry. Catherine was at the table with her lesson plans and she started to excuse herself, but Tom waved his hand. "It concerns the North Range," Tom said, "and your fence line, so it might as well concern her if she's here every day." Hugh's eyes flickered to her briefly and then back to Tom. "What happened?" "Bar S men cut your north fence last night," Tom said. "3 sections. Moved about 40 head of their cattle through onto your winter grass." Hugh was still, then he went to get his coat. "I'll ride with you," Tom said. "Catherine," Hugh said at the door, pulling on his coat, "stay in the house today." "Don't tell me to stay in the house," she said calmly. He stopped. He turned and looked at her with that measuring look, and she held it without flinching. "Please stay in the house today," he said. "There are men out there who don't need to see a woman alone in this situation. Not for your sake, for what it might complicate." She thought about that for a moment. He was not wrong. This was 1884 in Wyoming territory, and a woman's presence in a range dispute could be used as leverage in ways she did not want to be used as leverage. She conceded the point. "Be careful," she said. He nodded and went out. She watched him ride out with Tom Lyle through the kitchen window, 2 men on horseback moving through the gray February morning with the particular purpose of men who have been wronged on their own land, and she felt something so fierce and protective that it surprised her. Hugh and Tom came back 3 hours later with the Bar S cattle driven back through the gap itself closed with temporary wiring, and the particular look of men who have said things to other men that had not been comfortable but had been necessary. Tom Lyle went back to his own place. Hugh came inside. "How was it?" Catherine asked. "Settled," Hugh said, "for now." He sat down at the table and she put coffee in front of him. He wrapped his hands around the mug. Wade Cutter was there. "I told him that if any Bar S cattle cross my fence line again, I'll be filing with the territorial marshal. And if the territorial marshal doesn't act, I'll go to the federal level. The Bar S is a big outfit but not big enough to survive a federal investigation into land practices." "Is that true?" "It's true enough to work," he said. She sat down across from him. "Hugh," he looked up. "This land is yours," she said. "Fairly and legally yours. Don't let them push you off it." He looked at her with an expression she had been seeing more and more frequently, something that was both grateful and something else. Something that turned slightly inward, as though he were feeling something he was not quite ready to examine in public, even the small public of a kitchen table. "I don't intend to," he said. The winter deepened, and then, in the way of Wyoming winters, it began infinitesimally to loosen. February gave way to March with a slowness that required faith. The days were slightly longer. The light had a different quality in the afternoons. Catherine felt it in the way she had always felt seasonal changes, not as weather data but as a shift in something beneath the surface of the world. March also meant the stage would be running again. She was aware of that. She was aware of it in a way that was not simple. On the one hand, the ability to go somewhere if she chose to was reassuring. On the other hand, the question of whether she wanted to go anywhere was no longer the simple question it had been when she arrived. She had a school. She had students who were progressing. She had a room in a man's house and a place at his table, and an evening arrangement involving books and coffee and conversation that had become the thing she walked home to every afternoon. She had, she knew, fallen in love with Hugh Bristol somewhere between November and March, with the thoroughness of someone who does not fall quickly, but falls completely when they finally fall. She had not told him this. She was not sure how to tell him, or whether it would be welcome, because Hugh Bristol was a man who was very good at holding himself at the precise distance that was most comfortable, and she was not certain that comfort was the same as desire. He was kind to her. He had been generous to a degree she was still not comfortable accepting. He read with her and talked with her and looked at her sometimes with that particular expression that she did not yet know how to read conclusively. The question resolved itself on a Thursday afternoon in the middle of March, when she came home from school to find him on the porch in the pale early spring sunshine, sitting in the chair he had put there in February for the days when the light was good enough to read in. He had a book in his hands, but he was not reading it. He was looking at the track toward town. She came through the gate and up the path, and he looked at her and said, without preamble, "The stage runs again next week." "I know," she said. "Are you going to be on it?" She set down her bag on the porch railing and looked at him. He was looking at her with a directness that was slightly different from his usual directness, slightly more exposed. "Do you want me to be on it?" she asked. "No," he said. Then he stopped, as if that single word had used up everything he had prepared, and looked at the field beyond the fence where Clara and the rest of the small herd were dark shapes in the pale grass, and then looked back at her. "I want you to stay," he said. "I want you to stay because this house is better with you in it, and because the school needs someone who actually knows what they're doing, and because when you read out loud I think about it the rest of the day, and because I don't know what I'm going to do with the evenings when they're just evenings again instead of what they've been." She was quiet for a moment, holding the fullness of what he had just said. "Hugh," she said, "I have been in love with you since approximately Christmas Eve." He stared at her. "I walked home beside you in the snow," she said, "and you said you were glad the pass iced over early, and I nearly told you then. But the cold was very cold, and you were looking at the stars, and I was not certain." "Not certain of what?" "Of whether you wanted to be loved," she said. "Some people don't. Some people have arranged their lives very deliberately around not needing it, and I didn't want to be the thing that disturbed that arrangement without an invitation." Hugh stood up from the chair. He was 2 steps from her, and he closed that distance in one movement and put his hands on either side of her face, his palms warm against her cold cheeks, and looked at her with an expression that was no longer careful at all, that had the door thrown wide open on something she had not fully seen in him before. And then he kissed her. He kissed her with the same quality he brought to everything he did, with complete attention and no performance, and a kind of thoroughness that made the world very small and very warm and entirely centered on this porch in this moment in the March sunshine of Wyoming territory. When he pulled back, he kept his hands on either side of her face, and they looked at each other from a very small distance. "I want you to stay," he said again, and this time it meant something larger than a room. "I'm going to stay," she said. She was not on the stage when it ran the following week. She watched it pass through town on its way north, the first stage of the new season, loaded with goods and carrying 2 men in heavy coats, and she felt nothing but the particular lightness of a decision that fits exactly right. Spring came in earnest in April, and brought the mud and the noise of returning birds and the smell of grass growing, and the transformation of the land around Hugh's property that she had not seen yet, because she had arrived in its frozen version. The pasture opened up into something wide and golden green. The creek to the east of the property ran full and bright with snowmelt. The hills to the north, which had been white for months, went slowly gray, and then the gray went slowly green, and watching all of it happen was one of the most satisfying things Catherine had ever experienced. Hugh taught her to ride in April, on a patient bay mare named Abilene, who seemed to understand that her job was to be educational rather than fast. Catherine had ridden before, a little in the city context, but riding in Wyoming was a different skill requiring a different relationship with the animal and the ground, and Hugh was a patient teacher in the same way he was a patient learner, precise about what mattered, quiet about everything else. One afternoon they rode out to the north pasture, to the fence line where the Bar S incident had occurred, and Hugh showed her the new posts he and Tom Lyle had sunk in March, solid and straight. The Bar S had not come back. The territorial marshal had paid a visit to the Bar S operation in February, apparently having received a letter from someone whose language about federal consequences had been considered convincing. Wade Cutter had been seen in town once since then and had not come near Hugh's property. They sat on their horses at the fence line and looked north at the hills. "My grandfather built a house," Hugh said, "in Ohio. He built it the year he married my grandmother, before he had any money to speak of, and he built it with what he had at the time, 2 rooms and a leaking roof. He fixed the roof the next year and added 2 more rooms the year after that and a proper barn the year after that. When he died, it was a house with 8 rooms and a smokehouse and an apple orchard. Catherine listened. He used to say the house was a record of his life, Hugh said. Every addition was something that happened. The 3rd room was my father's birth. The smokehouse was a good year. She understood where this was going. She let it go there. I've been thinking about adding a room to the east side, Hugh said. The house is only ever going to be what I make it. That's true, she said. He looked at her. What do you think would be worth adding a room for? She held his gaze in the bright April light. I think, she said, that depends on whether you're asking me something. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and drew out something she had not expected, a ring. It was not new, but it was beautiful, a simple band of silver with a small rose-cut garnet in a plain setting, the kind of jewelry that had been made by someone who cared about craft. It was my mother's, he said. I've been carrying it since January and I haven't known how to say the right thing. I'm not a man who is good at saying things in the way they're supposed to be said. Hugh, she said, and her voice was not quite steady. You gave me your whole house within 5 minutes of meeting me. You moved a stove across town so my students wouldn't freeze. You read poetry by firelight and named a calf Clara when you thought I wasn't listening. You don't need to say it in any particular way. He looked startled at the Clara revelation, and she smiled, and he shook his head in a way that was almost a laugh, which was the closest Hugh Bristol usually got to laughing. Will you marry me, Catherine? He said. Yes, she said. I will. He reached across the space between their horses and she took his hand, and he slid the ring onto her finger, and the garnet caught the April light and threw a small point of red fire across her palm. And the horses stood quietly in the spring grass, and the world was, at that particular moment, entirely and completely good. They were married in the Harlan Creek Church on the 5th of May, 1884, on a clear morning that smelled of sage and new grass. The whole town came, because Harlan Creek was small enough that the whole town could come, and did, every time something worth coming to happened. Eli Carpenter stood as a witness. Percy Grubb cried, which he denied vigorously for weeks afterward. Anna Carpenter brought wildflowers she had gathered from the creek bank and arranged them on the altar. Ruddy and Dex Moss arrived exactly on time, which was considered a kind of miracle by everyone who knew them. Catherine wore the best dress she owned, which was not the faded burgundy traveling dress but a dark blue wool she had bought from the dressmaker in town. A woman named Harriet Morse who had produced it in 3 weeks of determined work, and charged Catherine a very fair price because she was, Harriet said, the first real teacher they'd had, and the children of this town were her nieces and nephews in spirit if not in blood. Hugh wore a clean white shirt and a dark vest and his best boots, and he looked, Catherine thought, exactly like himself except more so. He stood at the altar with a stillness that was entirely different from nervousness. It was the stillness of a man who is exactly where he has decided to be. Reverend Gale performed the ceremony with warmth and brevity, which Catherine appreciated. When Hugh said the words, he said them the way he said everything, directly and without embellishment, and with a sincerity that needed no amplification. When Catherine said hers, she looked at him and meant every word down to the molecular level. They rode home together through the May afternoon. Tom Lyle and his wife Margaret had arranged a gathering at the house with food that had apparently been organized by half the women in town, something Hugh had had no knowledge of, and whose discovery made his expression do several complicated things in rapid succession before settling on genuine pleasure. The party lasted until the sun went down behind the western hills, and the stars came out, and people ate and talked, and someone produced a fiddle, and there was dancing on the porch. Catherine danced with Eli Carpenter, who was a better dancer than his bearing suggested, and with Tom Lyle, who was not, and then Hugh took her hand for the last dance of the evening, and they moved on the porch boards in the lamplight with the warmth of the house behind them and the spring night ahead of them. And his hand was at her back, and she had her cheek against the shoulder of his white shirt, and she felt the steady, reliable reality of him, and knew that she had ended up precisely where she was supposed to be. Everyone went home. The house was quiet, the lamps burned low. It was their home now, the whole of it. Not a room given in generosity to a cold stranger, but a whole life built together in a place they both chose, and the choosing was the foundation. The summer that followed was the kind of summer that seems, in memory, to have been entirely made of light. Catherine taught through May, and then handed the school over to a summer arrangement, a local woman who agreed to hold classes twice a week so the students would not lose all their progress by fall. She used the summer for other things, helping Hugh with the cattle records, which she improved significantly with the introduction of a ledger system she designed specifically for his operation, expanding her curriculum for the fall term, and learning the land. That was what she thought of it as, learning the land. She rode out with Hugh almost every day, and he showed her the country in the way that you show someone something you love, with patience and without simplification, and she absorbed it. She also learned the ways of the house. She was not a natural cook in the way Hugh was, her domestic education having been somewhat theoretical, but she was determined and methodical, and by July she could make a passable stew and an excellent pie, which Percy Grubb sampled at a gathering and declared possibly the best pie he had encountered, which was possibly an exaggeration but a welcome one. In August, she told Hugh she was going to have a child. She told him in the evening, at the table where they had spent so many evenings, and she watched his face move through something that was too large for any of the usual words. He put down the book he had been holding and looked at her with an expression she had never seen before on anyone, something made of joy and terror, and a depth of feeling that seemed to require the whole face to hold. "Are you certain?" he said. "Doc Hayward confirmed it this morning." Hugh stood up from the table and came around to her and crouched down beside her chair so he was at her level and took both her hands in his. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just held her hands and looked at her. "I'm going to add 2 rooms," he said finally, and his voice was slightly unsteady in a way she had never heard it be. She laughed, and the laugh came from somewhere deep and genuine and unguarded, and he looked at her laugh with the expression of a man watching something he cannot quite believe he deserves. "Build the rooms, Hugh," she said. He built them. In September and October, while the weather was still workable, he and Tom Lyle and 2 men from town raised the east addition of the house, 2 rooms with proper windows and a connecting door to the main room. He was meticulous about it in the way he was meticulous about everything. The angles were right. The timber was well chosen. The windows were set to catch the morning light. By the 1st of November, the addition was complete, and the house that had sheltered one person for 7 years now had space for the life that was growing inside it. Catherine's students came back to school in September, and she returned to teaching with the particular energy of someone who has spent a summer thinking about what they want to do differently. She had written to a supplier in Cheyenne over the summer and acquired 3 new readers and a proper set of arithmetic flashcards and a globe, a small painted globe that arrived in a crate of straw and that she placed on the corner of her desk, and that the children treated with a reverence that pleased her deeply. Pearl Whitmore's spectacles had arrived in July, and when Pearl walked into school in September and could actually see the board clearly for the first time, her face had done something that Catherine would hold in her memory for the rest of her life. It was the face of someone to whom the world has just become a larger place. The winter of 1884 was different from the winter of 1883 in every way that mattered. Catherine was not arriving cold and frightened and alone with nothing reserved. She was here, rooted and certain, in her own home with her own man and her own students, and a child on the way. The cold was still cold and the snow was still snow, but she had learned to love the particular beauty of Wyoming in winter, the clean precision of it, the way the land's bones showed when the surface was stripped away. Hugh had fitted the barn with a better heating arrangement for the animals, and he no longer slept out there, which meant they spent the long winter evenings together in the house in the pattern they had built the previous year, books and coffee and conversation, now with the addition of the kind of conversation that belongs only to two people building a future together. Discussions about the child's name, about the spring cattle sales, about whether Anna Carpenter had the makings of a lawyer or a scientist, since she was clearly going to be one or the other. About the letter Catherine had received from her cousin in Cheyenne saying she was thinking of coming west. About small things and large things and the entire ordinary extraordinary middle. One evening in December, a few days before Christmas, Hugh came in from checking on the cattle with something in his coat pocket. He put it on the table in front of her. It was a small wooden box, very plainly made. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it," he said. Inside the box was a piece of carved wood, small enough to fit in her palm, shaped into a figure she recognized immediately as Clara the calf, with the proportions exaggerated slightly toward the round and charming in a way that was different from Hugh's usual precision. "You carved this," she said, "in the evenings when you were at your desk." He sat down across from her. "For the child, for when she or he is old enough to appreciate it." She held the small carved calf in her hand. She looked at the care in it, the smoothed edges, the patience it had taken to make something so deliberately impractical when he could have spent the time on any number of the practical things there were always to do. "It's wonderful," she said, and that word was not enough, but it was what she had. "The child should know about Clara," he said. "Clara is part of this story." She looked up at him with the carved calf in her hand and the fire bright behind her, and the snow coming down outside the window again. Another winter, another beginning. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in November a year ago with nothing reserved and no plan and cold fingers and a spine made of iron. And she thought about the man who had opened his door and stepped back without hesitation. "Hugh," she said. "Yes. I love you," she said. Not because she had not said it before, but because it was true every time she said it in a different way. "I love you, Catherine," he said, and the way he said it with that full, unhesitating directness was the way he did everything when he finally committed to it. She set the carved calf on the windowsill between the two books that were still there, the almanac and the Scottish ballads, and it looked right there, at home between two things he had read and loved. On the 23rd of February, 1885, Catherine delivered their son in the bedroom of the house on the north edge of Harlan Creek, attended by Doc Hayward and Harriet Morse, who had developed a sideline in midwifery and was considerably better at it than she let on. The labor was long but not dangerous, and when it was done she lay in the quilted bed and held a dark-haired, furious, red-faced child who was making his opinion of the world very clear at considerable volume. Hugh came in when Doc Hayward let him and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with the expression Catherine had first seen on his face when she told him there was a child coming, that expression that was too large for ordinary words. "Hello," Hugh said to the infant very quietly. The infant improbably was quiet for a moment. "He heard you," Catherine said. "He's deciding whether to trust me," Hugh said. "He should. You're worth trusting." Hugh looked at her then, and the full weight of everything they were was in that look. He reached out and touched his son's small closed fist very gently with one finger. "James," Catherine said. "James Hugh Bristol." Hugh looked up from the baby to her. "You decided. Last week. Is that all right?" "It's exactly right," he said. James Hugh Bristol grew through his first year with the determined energy of someone who has decided that the world is interesting and wants more of it immediately. He was walking by 11 months, which delighted everyone, and talking in fragments by 13 months, which delighted Catherine and alarmed Hugh slightly, because the fragments included a surprising vocabulary considering the source. By the spring of 1886, he had taken a passionate interest in Clara and her subsequent calves, whom he visited in the barn at every opportunity with Catherine trailing behind, making sure he did not walk into anything large and unpredictable. The school had grown. By the fall of 1885, Catherine had 27 students, and by the spring of 1886, There were requests coming from families on outlying ranches who wanted to bring their children in by wagon twice a week. Eli Carpenter approved an expansion of the school fund, and the old claims office was replaced with a proper schoolhouse built over the summer of 1886, 2 rooms with good windows, and a reliable stove and a proper floor, which the town built together over the course of several weeks in the way that communities build things when they understand their purpose. Hugh contributed timber and labor. Tom Lyle contributed labor. Percy Grubb contributed his opinion on structural matters, which was not technically needed but was tolerated. Catherine stood at the edge of the building site one afternoon in July and watched the walls go up in the summer light, and felt the specific satisfaction of a person who has contributed something permanent to a place. The bar's trouble resolved itself in the spring of 1886 when the cattle market crashed exactly as Hugh had predicted it would. The great open-range cattle empires of Wyoming Territory had overextended catastrophically, running more cattle than the land could support through bad winters and overstocked ranges, and when the market turned and the losses began, they were enormous. The Bar S lost 2/3 of its cattle operation and sold off its expanded range at a loss. Wade Cutter left the territory for good, or at least for long enough that it amounted to the same thing. Hugh's operation, small and debt-free and thoughtfully managed, came through the crash intact and was one of the few in the region that did. Tom Lyle was not so fortunate. He had sold his east pasture to the Bar S and spent the money on cattle at the top of the market, and the crash hurt him badly. Hugh bought back the east pasture from the Bar S at its reduced price and sold it back to Tom Lyle at cost with a 10-year payment arrangement that Tom called the most generous thing anyone had ever done for him, and Hugh called a business arrangement between neighbors. Catherine suspected the truth was somewhere in between. The winter of 1886 brought a blizzard in January that lasted 3 days and buried the fence posts to their tops. The house held against it perfectly, the additions Hugh had built solid as the original, and the family spent 3 days inside with a child who was almost 2 and had the energy of something considerably larger than his physical size. Hugh and Catherine played every game she could invent and taught James the alphabet in song form, and Hugh read him half of a Dickens novel before Catherine pointed out that perhaps Dickens was a somewhat advanced choice for a 22-month-old. "He's listening," Hugh said. "He's asleep," Catherine said. "He was listening," Hugh said. She laughed and took the book from him and replaced it with the simpler and more age-appropriate Scottish ballads, which James did actually seem to respond to, possibly because of the rhythm, possibly because Hugh read them in a voice that was quiet and steady and felt like home. By the spring of 1887, Harlan Creek had grown. The railroad had extended a spur line to within 12 miles of the town in 1886, which changed things significantly. New families arrived. A doctor came, a proper one, to assist the aging Doc Hayward. A second general store opened, which Percy Grubb opposed vigorously, and then adjusted to with the philosophical practicality of a man who had seen enough of life to know when to stop fighting geography. Catherine's school was full, and she had trained a second teacher, a young woman named Ruth Delaney, who had arrived in the spring of 1887 from a teacher's college in Ohio, and who was intelligent and earnest and slightly overwhelmed by Wyoming, a feeling Catherine recognized thoroughly. She mentored Ruth with the patience of someone who remembers exactly what it felt like to arrive somewhere enormous and unknown. In the late summer of 1887, Catherine discovered she was expecting their second child. She told Hugh in the same way she had told him the first time, at the kitchen table in the evening, and his reaction was the same in its quality if more practiced in its expression. He did not crouch beside her chair this time. He came around the table and took her hands and looked at her with that full expression and said, "Another room, maybe." "One more room would be sensible," she agreed. "East or south?" "South for the light," he nodded. "South it is." Their daughter arrived in March of 1888, during a milder winter than the ones before it, with the speed and decisiveness of someone who has made up her mind and intends to be brief about the formalities. Doc Hayward said she was the most efficiently delivered child he had attended in 30 years of practice. Harriet Morse said she had spirit. James, who was 3 and had been waiting in the main room with Hugh's hand in his for 2 hours, wanted to know if the baby could play yet, and was disappointed but philosophical about the answer. They named her Eleanor Margaret Bristol, the Margaret for Hugh's mother, and she was from her first weeks a child of strong and specific opinions expressed at full volume, which Hugh accepted with equanimity, and Catherine recognized with a deep and private amusement as someone who also had strong and specific opinions. The south room was built that spring, light-filled and warm in the afternoons, which was where Eleanor's cradle sat, and where Catherine graded papers while the baby slept with the total unreserved commitment to sleep that infants have when they have decided the moment is right for it. The house on the north edge of Harlan Creek had become what Hugh's grandfather would have recognized, a record of a life. The original 2 rooms were the foundation, the story of a man alone making something solid. The East Addition was the story of a woman arriving with nothing reserved and being given everything with an open hand. The bedroom they shared was the story of a decision made in the spring by 2 people standing on a pasture fence line. The south room, light-filled and warm, was the story of a daughter. Anna Carpenter, who was 18 now and had become something of a legend in the school system that Catherine had built, was heading to a women's college in Denver in the fall of 1888. She came to Catherine in August to say goodbye, and the goodbye was the kind that takes a while because there is too much to say for any of it to be said quickly. "You changed what I thought was possible," Anna said. "You knew what was possible before I arrived," Catherine told her. "I just showed you the formal vocabulary for it." Anna looked at her with the bright, analytical eyes that had always seen everything clearly. "That's a Hugh Bristol kind of thing to say," she said. Catherine considered this. "Yes," she said, "I suppose it is." She smiled. "Travel safe, right when you arrive, and write down the problems that are interesting when you find them, not just when you solve them." Anna hugged her and then walked off down the street toward her father's store, upright and purposeful, 17 years old and aimed at the world. That evening Catherine told Hugh about the conversation at supper, with James eating loudly on her left and Eleanor making authoritative noises in her cradle across the room, and Hugh listened and then said, "She's going to be remarkable." "She already is," Catherine said. "More remarkable then," he said. James decided at this point to spill his cup of milk with a decisiveness that suggested it was intentional, and the evening proceeded in the direction that evenings with young children proceed, which is away from philosophy and toward practicality. And Catherine mopped up the milk and scolded gently, and Hugh produced a cloth from somewhere with the preparedness of an experienced father, and Eleanor expressed her opinion from her cradle, and the kitchen was full of noise and warmth, and the particular beautiful chaos of a family in its fullness. Later, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Hugh and Catherine sat together on the porch in the warm August night. The sky above Wyoming was enormous and clear, the same sky she had stood beneath on Christmas Eve 5 years ago and watched stars so dense they seemed to fill all the dark. The same man beside her, but not the same, more known, more familiar, more entirely and specifically himself than anyone else in the world. She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. In the barn, Clara, now 5 years old and very much a cow rather than a calf, made some ruminative sound that carried on the still air. "Percy Grubb told me today that the town is thinking of building a proper library," Hugh said. "A library," Catherine said. "Whose idea was that?" "He claimed it was the town council's." "I think it was Eli's. He's been reading what you give him for 2 years." He paused. "I told him he should ask you to run it alongside the school." She lifted her head to look at him. "Did you volunteer me without asking me?" "I mentioned that you would have opinions about how it should be organized," he said, "which is not the same as volunteering you. It's a very thin distinction. Do you want to run the library?" She thought about it for approximately 3 seconds. "Yes," she said. Obviously, yes. I thought so, he said. She put her head back on his shoulder. Out in the dark pasture, the cattle moved quietly through the summer grass. The night sounds of Wyoming surrounded them, the creek, the wind in the far trees, the deep silence underneath all of it that was not absence but presence, the presence of a land that had become theirs. In the years that followed, Harlan Creek continued to grow, and the Bristol family grew with it. James turned out to be his father's son in the matter of land and livestock, and his mother's son in the matter of reading and asking inconvenient questions, a combination that seemed likely to take him somewhere interesting. Eleanor Bristol, as predicted by everyone who met her early, was the kind of person who organizes the world around her through the force of her conviction that things ought to be done correctly, a trait that Hugh said came from Catherine, and that Catherine said came from Hugh, and that was probably their combined contribution to the universe. The library opened in the spring of 1890, in a building of real brick that the town was sufficiently proud of to want built to last. Catherine organized it with the system she had been designing in her head since Percy Grubb first mentioned it: subjects and alphabetization and a lending ledger, and a reading program for the children on Saturday mornings. She found that the work of building a library was not unlike the work of building a school. You start with what people need, and you add what they don't know they need yet, and you never stop adding. Hugh helped her move the books on the first day, carrying boxes from the wagon to the shelves with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything physical. When the last box was unpacked and the shelves were full, he stood in the middle of the library and looked at it. "Your grandfather would say this room is something that happened," Catherine said. He looked at her. "What happened?" "A woman arrived on the last stage before winter with nothing reserved," she said, "and decided to stay." He came to where she was standing and took her hand. "I'm glad you stayed," he said, which was exactly what he had said in several different ways over several different years, and which was exactly as true each time he said it. "I'm glad you opened the door," she said. Outside the new library, Harlan Creek went about its business in the spring sunshine of 1890. Horses moved up the main street. Children came out of the schoolhouse where Ruth Delaney was finishing the morning's lessons. Eli Carpenter was talking to someone outside his hardware store, with the hand gestures of a man making a point he considers important. Percy Grubb's store had new goods in the window that had come on the spur line from Cheyenne. The world moved and changed and grew, as it always does, in the direction of what the people in it are willing to build. In the house on the north edge of town, behind the fence of lodgepole pine rails that had weathered 7 additional years to a beautiful silver gray, smoke came from the chimney even in the spring, because the kitchen stove was always going, and that kitchen was always in use. James's drawings were pinned to the wall beside the bookcase, next to a folded piece of paper on which Eleanor had written, in letters that were large and definitive and absolutely certain of themselves, her full name. On the windowsill in the main room, between the almanac and the Scottish ballads, Clara the carved calf stood in its place as it had stood for 5 years, the first deliberately impractical thing Hugh Bristol had ever made, and the one that Catherine treasured above almost everything. She treasured it because it was made for a child who did not yet exist, at a table by a fire, by a man who was planning for a future he did not know the exact shape of, but was building toward anyway with everything he had. That was the thing she had learned most thoroughly in the years since she stepped off a cold stagecoach onto a frozen Wyoming street with nothing reserved and no plan and $22 and a spine made of iron. That the future is not something that arrives. It is something that is built, board by board and season by season, by people who show up and stay, and give what they have and keep giving even when the winter is long, and the pass is iced over, and there is no stage running until March. It is built by people who open doors. Hugh Bristol was a man who had opened his door to a stranger in November and given her his whole house, and in doing so had given her, without knowing or intending it, the exact life she had been looking for without knowing she was looking. She had given him, without knowing or intending it, the same. That was the whole story, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it went on.